Worship Master, right worshipful, worshipables, brethren all, greetings, good evening.
Good evening.
The name of my paper is you're the first ones. You're the first ones that are going to hear this. This is the first time I'm releasing this paper. It's called Freemasonry and its impact on the Constitutional Convention, or how a few good Masons kept their aprons clean while building a nation. And this is going to be one of the papers that is going to go into my book. And you're also the first ones that are finding out that I'm writing a book. The purpose of this paper is to investigate with all the gravity of a man searching for his misplaced gavel whether Freemasonry had any real influence on the delegates who gathered in Philadelphia in that summer of 1787 to write the U.S. Constitution. In other words, did America's founding fathers draft the Constitution in between handshakes, passwords, and secret knocks, or were they just ordinary men trying to get through the sweltering heat without starting another war? We know some facts, at least the kind that historians begrudgingly agree upon. 13 of the 39 signers were Masons at some point in their lives, and 11 of those were active members at the time. 2 others joined the club later on, proving perhaps that peer pressure was alive and well in the 18th century. But let's not get lost in the arithmetic. My real concern isn't how many of them were Masons, but what they thought, and whether any of those thoughts involved trowels, aprons, or columns labeled J and B. Unfortunately, this is where the evidence fades faster than the minutes of an early lodge meeting. 18th century Masonry was still figuring itself out, like a teenager trying to decide whether it was a guild, a fraternity, or an Enlightenment think tank with better snacks. The first Grand Lodge had only been formed in 1717, and even by 1787, Masons were still arguing about rituals, authority, and who was supposed to bring the working tools to the next meeting. Still, many scholars, notably Bernard Fay, who in 1935 wrote Revolution and Freemasonry 1680 to 1800, insist that Masonry was a major social force. Fay, never one to downplay a good conspiracy, described Freemasonry as a kind of intellectual secret society that went from stonecutters to soul polishers. According to him, by the Renaissance, people had stopped building cathedrals and started building philosophies, and Masonry reinvented itself to keep up. Out went mortar and chisels, in came moral improvement and metaphysics. Under the influence of John Theophilus de Sauvillers, a man whose name sounds like it should come with a powdered wig and its own echo, Masonry decided it would save the world from ignorance. Fay called it a great center of enlightenment. Dedicated to dispelling darkness, superstition, and atheists who refused to play along, it was, in short, the 18th century version of a TED Talk, only with candles and aprons. Meanwhile, the Masons themselves swore up and down that they weren't political. Sure, they met in taverns, wrote philosophical manifestos, and had friends in every government from London to Boston. But politics? Heaven forbid. The irony, of course, is that Masonry's very structure, with its votes, bylaws, and elected masters, was practically a dress rehearsal for democracy itself. As Freemasonry grew, so did the legend that it somehow masterminded revolutions on both sides of the Atlantic. Unfortunately, this claim is about as verifiable as Washington's wooden teeth. The records from early American lodges, and so spotty that even the Grand Lodge of England forgot to take notes for its first 6 years of existence. The Provincial Grand Lodge of Massachusetts fared a little better, which is to say that for an organization obsessed with order and record keeping, they were remarkably bad at paperwork. Even the modern Masonic historians, who according to Melvin M. Johnson, tended to add fiction to fable and imagination to both. In other words, if the facts didn't exist, they simply made up better ones. The result was a long tradition of historical storytelling that would make even the most creative cable documentary producer Blush. One popular claim is that Masonry and the U.S. Constitution share identical DNA, that the founders borrowed their entire playbook from the Lodge. Supposedly, while drafting the Constitution, they were channeling Bacon, Newton, and Locke, with maybe a pinch of Montesquieu for flavor. Washington and half a dozen Grand Masters were said to have laid wide and deep the foundations of liberty, through presumably with less actual mortar. But there's one glaring problem with this romantic narrative: the facts. The Constitution's preamble, that soaring "we the people" bit, was written not by a Mason, but by Governor Morris, a man who was, by all accounts, not much for secret handshakes. Of the 5 men on the committee that drafted it, 4 weren't Masons at all. So, if we're giving credit where credit is due, the preamble was more secular civic poetry than Masonic cipher. What the convention actually was, according to Catherine Drinker Bowen's The Miracle at Philadelphia, was a gathering of practical men determined to stop talking about the rights of man and start figuring out who was going to pay the bills. They weren't quoting Rousseau or Locke. They were arguing about representation, executive power, and who got how many seats at the national table. Whenever anyone started waxing philosophical, John Dixon was there to pull them back to earth with his famous quip, "Experience must be our only guide." Translation: less theory, more doing. Even the Masons in the room couldn't agree amongst themselves. Washington sat in dignified silence, though through most of the proceedings, proving that even then he knew the value of letting other people argue while you quietly became a legend. Franklin, of course, couldn't resist talking. It was, after all, his natural state. Others like Bedford and Brearley took up arms for states' rights, while the Virginians couldn't decide whether to sign or to sulk. In the end, Masons and non-Masons alike behaved as you'd expect, from men locked in a hot room for months with no air conditioning. They compromised. They didn't caucus as Masons. They caucused as exhausted patriots. When the document was finally signed, some refused, some relented, and all of them went home convinced that posterity would sort it out, which, inconveniently, we still are. And yet, for all the speculation, the parallels between Masonry and the Constitution are hard to ignore. Both were born out of chaos. Both built on compromise. And both were obsessed with balance, order, and enlightenment. When Joseph Ford Newton said Masonry had undergone a complete revolution in 1717, he might as well have been describing the political miracle of 1787. Both reinvented the idea of authority, one with compasses, the other with constitutions. Masonry gave itself grand lodges. America gave itself a president. The Masons gave that office nearly absolute power, though thankfully their Grand Masters rarely abused it. The Americans followed suit, creating a president with power greater than the king's, but elected by something slightly more democratic than nodding in a lodge. Finally, both Masonry and the Constitution agreed on one thing: keep politics and religion out of the lodge, or at least argue about it somewhere else. Anderson's constitutions of 1723 made it official: no politics, no religious tests, and please, no dukes trying to overthrow the crown again. America, for its part, enshrined similar principles: freedom of belief, separation of powers, and the right to keep your aprons clean. In conclusion, Freemasonry didn't so much build the Constitution as provide a kind of philosophical scaffolding, a handy model of order, a civility, a mutual respect that showed the founders how to argue without throwing punches. American Freemasonry wisely chose never to unite under one national Grand Lodge, preferring to let each state do its own thing, which coincidentally is exactly what they agreed to do in Philadelphia. So did the Masons influence the Constitution? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing is certain. They knew how to keep minutes, wear their aprons, and when it mattered most, put first things first, even if that meant leaving the Tyler outside and the politics at the door. I remain Prophet Frank J. Sforza, past monarch, Supreme Council District Deputy, Grand Historian, Grottos International. Thank you very much.
Thank you.